the last panel of today.
A tyrant in the chair.
Yes. Hopefully. What is it? This is the reverse of the what is it called, that velvet glove and something something, no? So I'm the other way around. Anyway, basically we are talking in terms of constructing a legal right to housing. And if you recollect, in that 1.5 minutes that I spoke at the inauguration, one of the things I was saying is that as law people, we have not deliberated enough on what is it that when you try to bring something within the frame of the law or keep it outside it, what are its costs and benefits? What is it that you get from it? What is it that you lose out? Generally speaking, in most places, when people ask for a law, we just jump and say, yeah, we will give it to you in no time and we'll have it all solved. I think we're doing something kind of a reverse here in trying to say, no, listen, halt it. We want to think more on what is it that we get when we make something a legal right or not. In the last panel, we were speaking in terms of a range of interventions in schemas and programs that people have done around the right to housing. We also spoke in terms of the benefit or otherwise of using courts. In this particular panel, we are kind of focusing attention much more on what is it when you want to make a legislation which is going to be encapsulating, endorsing the right to house. And that's why it's called Come Anand. This is Anand as Krishna too. He's because Solly Benjamin could not come, he was requested. And he said, yes, in his village, when they did Mahabharata, they had Krishna 1 and Krishna 2. So considering he was already Krishna 2, he played Krishna 1 in the previous panel. Now he's coming in his own role. So, so having said all of that, I think, Anandita, can we please have you tell us the difference between a right and a legal right, and what were the various things which worried you as you were doing this study? And I can tell you, as she worried, the rest of us were continuously killed. Come.
It really does crash. Okay, the chair is very kind to me, but yeah, so it did. When I started looking at the right to housing about a couple of years ago or so, I wasn't really drawing that distinction between a legal right and a moral right. In my mind, when I thought of a right, because maybe I was so imbued in the law school way of functioning, I was thinking of the law by default. Until, of course, you kind of start looking for the law in relation to housing and realize, wait, 1 minute, it isn't as easy as all that. Because you have to literally dig it out of little corners in the Indian context. Which was the reason why I suppose I was forced to think about the more fundamental question. Or maybe the most fundamental question is whether we want to talk about this in the context of rights at all. But that's the question I will shelve for now. But the question that I began with, which is on the assumption that we are speaking in the context of a rights discourse, is that distinction between a moral claim, moral right to housing, and its translation into the law, given that the legal standing of the right to housing in the Indian context is ambiguous. I wouldn't say it's clearly recognized by the law, nor would I say that there is no legal recognition. There's ambiguity. And I think that distinction is important to think through for the simple reason that as lawyers, we don't think often enough about the costs of absorbing an idea or a set of claims into the law. One of the reasons why this comes up repeatedly in housing, and it came up repeatedly in our session previously as well, is that it's really hard to define what is the substance of the right that you're speaking about. What is it that you wish to guarantee when you speak of the right to housing? Because it covers such a wide range of deprivations, as well as therefore a wide range of ways of redressing those deprivations. So one thing that the law does constantly is define. And if you were to think of a legal right to housing, you would necessarily have to define that right in order for it to be something that you can actually, in concrete terms, claim. And there is, I think, a fair fear that defining in the law a right to housing would reduce it to a right to houses, which I think, as Dr. Maringanti also said emphatically, would be half the battle lost. Because we've had in policies as well this urge to shift from a more, an organic understanding of housing that encompasses cultural context, encompasses livelihood concerns, thinks about education, etc., to requirements of 15-foot by X-foot, spaces that have no tie to a person's particular context. So this fear that translating this moral claim into the law would reduce it to something that is concrete, for that reason sometimes desirable, but at the same time very hard to play around with, hard to particularize, is one that I'm still grappling with. But the second question that, if we were to move on, comes is, what do you mean when you say a legal recognition of a right? When you're saying that you want to translate a moral right into a legal one, what does that even mean? Because shelter, at least in the Indian context, has been read into the right to life and personal liberty by the Supreme Court. Does that mean that the right to housing, insofar as it consists of the common minimum of adequate shelter, has already been legally recognized? But if you look at the cases that have articulated the right to shelter, you find that absent any black letter law that already supports the rights claimant's claim, this recognition has predominantly been rhetorical. So even where courts have said that the right to shelter is a part of Article 21, yada, they have gone ahead and permitted evictions, so that disjuncture between the rhetorical recognition of the right and the practice that actually comes through is also something that one needs to grapple with. So has it even been judicially recognized is up for grabs. If we are to move beyond the courts and think in terms of engaging with the legislature, speaking about constructing a legal right, then what is it that we're seeking? Do we want an inclusion of the right into the fundamental chapter, as was done with education? There have been several amendments proposed to the Constitution on at least 3 different occasions, but all as private member bills, and private member bills are rarely even discussed, let alone passed. I think one has been passed in one house in 75 years. But do we wish to have a fundamental right to housing? How does one set about looking at that? The amendments that have been proposed so far usually say something along the lines of every family shall have the right to shelter as the state might by law determine, which is again pretty much aspirational. It's not really giving you a concrete entitlement. There was one effort in India to draft a comprehensive housing rights legislation and alongside suggest amendments, constitutional inclusion, which was done by the National Housing Rights Campaign. I think the last draft was floated in 1992. And it took a couple of years to get that document together. I think some of those who were involved in the process are here. But that had a constitutional amendment that recognized that sought the recognition of a right to housing that is deeply detailed, that speaks about the right to material, the right to a certain sort of location, the rights in the main, outside of maybe Article 15, is that it is a claim against the state. There is, I think, a pressing need to think of rights in the Indian context horizontally, as in claims against fellow individuals as well. So whether it is, especially in the context of discrimination. So this is coming especially from the fact that across the country you have Dalit families being forced to the fringes of villages, being unable to access common resources, etc., simply because of discriminatory practices. And this is not often discussed as a housing issue, which is, it's often, as in housing as such, is very often discussed as an urban concern. It immediately speaks to the right to the city. But if we are to broaden that canvas, then this right against horizontal discrimination assumes a certain sort of importance. And it's the sort of right you can put in as a fundamental right that does not curtail the idea of the right to housing in any which way. The other portion, the other right that I do think deserves some kind of non-negotiable recognition in the law is the right against dehousing, which is to say that in the present moment we have legislations and statutory frameworks in place that facilitate the loss of housing, let alone facilitate access to housing. They do the opposite. And there is a need to undo this. And I think that encoding that as a non-negotiable is a pressing requirement. However, on the question of building a statute, and I'm not saying this in the air because every couple of years there is some move to have a right to housing statute enacted. They're all mostly hogwash, with the exception of the NHRC bill, which never really made it to Parliament. You usually have things like, the Jhuggi Jhopri, and you had one bill in 2006, another bill that dropped one section from the 2006 bill in 2007. It's usually in response to the opposition making the claim that it would ensure access to housing. So a private member from the opposition party would table a bill in Parliament with obviously no chance of it ever seeing the light of day. But there is a constant conversation about enacting a legislation on the subject, which begs the question that I was raising earlier as well as to jurisdiction. Who enacts a legislation on the subject? Every single legislation that has been proposed so far has been central, while practically everybody who writes on the subject would agree that it's a housing, if it is to be considered within the framework of the three lists, is a state subject, now a local government subject, more expressly. If that is the case, then why is it that we're constantly seeking centralized lawmaking? One of the reasons, of course, and the NHRC bill had chosen to amend the constitution to make housing a central subject in order to be able to pass a central statute. And its logic was that to get states to ask the center to pass a law, or to get each individual state to enact a law on the subject, is going to be an incredibly long struggle. And it makes more sense to have the center pass a statute and have states particularize through subordinate legislation. that's a questionable premise because subordinate legislation is bound by its parent legislation. And unless you wish to enact a skeletal law, which doesn't really have any substance to it, and therefore everything needs to come in through subordinate legislation, which then why are you doing at all? Unless you're doing that, then the state's power to particularize will be curtailed by the center. Besides, the very nature of housing, I think, is that it requires specific redressal based on specific situations. So the idea of constructing a central law seems slightly problematic. I'll move on to just this one other question, which is that, is there a way to think about recognizing the right to housing using legal instruments without necessarily articulating the right in law? So some of the things that I think are possibilities, for example, is that whenever we speak of approaching a court against eviction, for example, it's almost always in the language of the right to life. It seeds from the very beginning the possible claim that the land is owned legitimately or held legitimately, possessed legitimately by the people who are being evicted. So is it possible to think in terms of claims of estoppel? Because there are often, these are places that have, been in existence for several years. So the Brazilian constitution, for example, does recognize the claim of estoppel for those who do not already hold title. So for those in urban centers who don't own title and have spent time on a particular patch of land for over 5 years, can claim ownership over that land through sorry, this is not estoppel, this is adverse possession. I beg your pardon, blame the nerves. So the claim of adverse possession is something that you can think through in the context of efforts to stall state or private action that evicts persons. The claim of estoppel that I was speaking of was that most eviction actions are against places that have received government services. In Hyderabad, there are certain places where the government will give you electricity, but with the caveat that this does not mean we are endorsing this illegal, settlement. What is that supposed to mean? There are places where people have paid property tax for years on end and are still being told that they do not have legal title and can be evicted at the whim of the state. So in those sorts of situations, it is possible that an argument of estoppel be made, which we've not really seen in the Indian context. We've mostly seen just the right to life sort of argument being made. Okay, so I am overshooting time, so I will end here. But I think my fundamental question is that there are very many sites at which a moral claim can be made, even within the law. And there is no one monolithic legal recognition as such. And perhaps it's about time we strategically picked out those sites where we would like to make those claims.
Thank you, Anandita. The next speaker is I'm kind of asking Netta to respond to Anandita's study in two kinds of ways. One, because Netta was kind enough to read her study in advance, so she's aware of the full study. And two, because Netta herself has been very closely engaging with questions of housing, and especially in relation to the Arab population and their housing rights and sort of thing. I feel that larger context within that, if you could sort of... Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it.
So I think it's not coincidental that we cannot find many laws that recognize positively the right to housing. That we can find it on the constitutional level and in the international human rights level, and then we can find it in regulations and policies, but not in law. And I think we touched upon some of the reasons for it. We said that it's really hard to define what housing includes. It means many things to many people because there is an issue of local government versus central government, which changes from place to place. It touches upon property issues also. And I want to offer an additional characteristic that housing, by and large, in capitalist societies, is a resource that is allocated through the market. And I want to start with an example. I've been teaching a clinic, a housing clinic in Tel Aviv for 12 years. And for many years, my clinic was labeled a housing rights clinic. And we actually dealt with housing rights, representing tenants on different issues. And at some point, we changed our policy and we started to go in working in the same neighborhoods with the same people on the same problems. But we decided to change the strategy and to work on social housing development. The minute we changed the name, we had, while in the first round we had 70% female and 30% male, the minute we went into housing development, we had 70% guys and 30% gals, okay? So we asked the guys, why are you coming to the housing clinic? Said, because this is a real estate clinic. And we want to study to learn how to be real estate lawyers rather than helping poor people solve their housing problems. So this was very interesting because in the clinic, we actually do real estate law. We do transactional law. We do a little bit of financing. We do contracts. We do planning and zoning. We don't go to court. And I think the story of from housing to real estate and from real estate to housing tells a lot about what we're talking about here. And I'm sorry that David is not here right now because I wanted to offer human rights as a bridge, yet another bridge, from talking about housing in the context of the market and talking about housing in the context of the state. And I want to start by a short quote from the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing a few years ago. She says a dramatic shift occurred in housing policies, starting with North America, followed by countries in Latin America, Asia, Africa. The shift calling for the transfer of activities from state control to the private sector and for unrestricted markets soon gained hegemony, shaping the policy of the states, international financial institutions, and development agencies. The effects on housing policies have been striking. The new role of the state as enabler led to creating conditions and institutions to support housing finance systems to promote home ownership under the new liberal dogma of reliance on private property and market forces. And therefore, I think that when we talk about housing under this new, not so new anymore, yes, but I guess ideology, it's not just policy, it's ideology, we really have to articulate both our theory of change and our theory of state. Because it's very hard to understand what we want from the state if we don't have a theory of what is the role of the state here and where do we think the allocation of resources should be. And obviously there's no good answer for this. Most countries still believe that the state should provide education and the state should provide health and the state should provide welfare. So it's easier to legislate on the right to education, the right to health, and the right to welfare. Most developed countries, Western capitalized countries, do not think that the state should be the main provider of housing. If at all, the state should be the one that in a very minimal welfare state provides housing through direct provision to the very poor. And we know what happens when we have a minimal welfare state that maybe catches the bottom part of the economic echelon, but doesn't really look at what's happening above. And it's not that I think that this division between negative. Oh, you missed my punch. Okay, I won't say it. I talked about you. So I still think that it's a good idea analytically to differentiate between dehousing and the positive right to housing. It works because the law still has a very important role in preventing us from losing something that we already have, whether it's formal title or informal title. And the security of title, the security of tenure is one of the components of the right to housing in international human rights law. And therefore, the law, through an articulate legal development, like you said, whether we're talking about adverse possession or estoppel or substantive property rights.
10-day stay order. The Delhi Development Authority went back saying that, no, these people are eligible, let us demolish them. So the court said, okay. So because there were demolitions today, the people went back to the court and the court said, we'll see on Monday, but we don't know what's going to happen on the weekend. So there's just a space that allows the state to get away with impunity, with a lack of accountability, and there is no reparation framework, right? So I think articulating a legal right is what would help us get accountability and a framework for reparations, which talks about restitution. Nowhere have we been able to get restitution for violation of housing rights. So I just wanted to set that before I come to the international legal framework. So international law has recognized the right to housing, and we do not see these debates happening even nationally on, should the right to food have a law, or should the right to equality have been put in the constitution, because, how do we define it? I think international law has given us a really great legal basis that could be incorporated. Virginia is here. The Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights has really deconstructed the right to housing. So you have, the General Comment 4, which tells you, this is what a right to housing means. You have General Comment 7, which says that forced evictions violate the right to housing. It defines forced evictions. Zeta mentioned the work of the special rapporteurs, and I think the body of soft law emerging internationally, recognizing the right to housing is very significant. Over the last few years, we've had 3 rapporteurs on housing. We have an evolving body of soft law that has recognized and elaborated on both the conceptual understanding of the right to housing as well as the normative framework and given us tools. So in 2002, the special rapporteur on adequate housing, spoke about guidelines to prevent segregation and discrimination in housing. Then we had the basic principles and guidelines on development-based evictions and displacement, which also spoke about concomitant rights, right? The right to return, very important. A lot of times in India, we find people are evicted, for example, in the Commonwealth Games in Delhi, or for these urban renewal beautification projects. 5-6 years later, the land is still lying vacant. So there is a right to return, which is being established in international law. The right to rehabilitation, not just resettlement, which includes the framework for restitution of your rights, the restoration of rights. So we have then the security of tenure guidelines from the second special rapporteur. And these, Anand, you mentioned, it talks about different tenure options, right? So from freehold, which is, when we talk of tenure, people only assume freehold is the option. But freehold is just one. So you have use rights, tenancy rights, collective rights, and freehold is just one of the options. But so there is a growing body, right? And then you have the Supreme Court, which has played a mixed role. We all know that. Recently, we have also documented positive case law from state high courts. And interestingly, some of the state high courts have been more creative than the Supreme Court. For example, the Delhi High Court, the Sadama Singh judgment that Justice A.P. Shah actually spoke about the right to housing. Most of the jurisprudence from the court has been talking about the right to shelter. And I think we need to make a distinction because shelter is limiting. Even though, I think the Chameli Singh judgment says right to shelter, but it incorporates a lot of the elements of General Comment 4. I just want to read something from the Chameli Singh judgment because it was passed in 96. And I think it really breaks this dichotomy of the civil, political, cultural, social rights, but also puts the need for India to recognize international law. So it says, right to life guaranteed in any civilized society implies the right to food, water, decent environment, education, medical care, and shelter. These are the basic human rights known to any civilized society. All civil, political, social, and cultural rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Covenants or under the Constitution of India cannot be exercised without these basic human rights. So this was in 96. So I think the legal space for articulating the right to housing has been created, and I think we really need to move forward. There's an interesting case from the Karnataka court, right, which was the Millennium Education Trust against the state of Karnataka, which actually says that Dalits and scheduled tribes must have recognition of their right to housing. It even calls upon the state to adopt a human rights approach to housing to deal with the housing crisis in the country. So how do we move forward? Because the biggest challenges we faced, the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing was here last year on mission to India. She met with the government of India, and in all our work with the central government, state government, central government especially, there is this obstinate refusal to recognize housing as a human right in India. So when you talk to the Secretary on Housing, she doesn't even know that we have ratified the international covenant. I mean, they're not reporting, but they do not even know that we have ratified. So there is a stubborn resistance to accept that housing is a human right. And the government, like you mentioned, Anindita, they'll say that, it's not, we can't give houses to everybody. So you cannot, but the right to housing is not the right to houses. So I think there's a challenge over there. The other challenging of not having a right to housing is the commodification of housing. We all know that the shift, even if you look at the Planning Commission documents across plan, you'll see that, state was provider of housing and now it's the enabler. I mean, we've done away with those 5-year plans, but you'll see how that shift has very strategically been introduced. And the role is to facilitate the market to provide housing. So until we have a right to housing, how are people going to be able to exercise that right? I think just allowing, the court to interpret it the way it feels like is too risky now. We have too much to lose. There's also a systematic delinking of housing with land. So in state policy, you'll see that there is just no link between the ministries that work on land, the ministries that work on housing, at the central level, at the state level. I have done a search in all the policies related to housing. Nowhere does the word rights appear. The only way it comes is in TDR, transfer development rights. Nowhere is the rights approach there. And people are called beneficiaries of projects or customers or consumers. They are not rights holders. So how do you hold a state accountable when it has a policy that says the market will provide housing only if you fit these 5 categories, right? And most people cannot prove those eligibility criteria. Even the Delhi government policy that Indu mentioned, it starts off saying that, housing is a human right. But if you are displaced, you only get housing if you can prove that you have lived there. Your settlement has to have been there before 2006. You have to pay 1.5 lakh rupees. So there are all these criteria. It does not talk about the right to housing. So I think this is a big tension over here where we have progressive orders of the court. They are not implemented. A Sudama Singh judgment was passed in 2010. It's 2017 now, not implemented. So there is just a complete lack of recognition. There's complete impunity of the state, and there is no way to hold them accountable. The other dangerous trend I find is that the shifting from policies to missions and schemes. So this government is all about slogans, right? Whether it's housing for all, or whether it's Smart Cities mission or Amrut, they have a mission for everything. But I cannot go to court saying that, okay, the mission was not implemented, You need a justiciable framework to exercise your right. And the dangerous thing with these schemes is that there are no human rights indicators to monitor. So just like a Swachh Bharat mission has become about just the number of toilets built, the linkages are not there. So unless we say that, how many homeless people have been able to get permanent housing? What are the social housing projects in the country? There is no provision of social housing because the market is not interested in social housing. There is a draft, social housing policy coming up. It doesn't talk about social rental. Again, the market is expected to come in and provide rental housing. So when we talk to the Ministry of Housing and say that, you need a right to housing law, the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing has also recommended it. They say, no, every rich people are going, they're all building their own homes, the market is there. And for the homeless people, we have shelters, and the very poor people, we have PMAY. So the imagination also is that a homeless person lives in a shelter, right? There are no schemes for them to access housing, even financial schemes. So I think right now, there are a lot of challenges, I agree, but I think the National Campaign for Housing Rights really set a precedent. It was a very consultative process. So in terms of moving forward, I think we need a big national campaign. And every city and state, and even in the rural areas, people are saying we need a right to housing bill. Of course, this has to come from the people. It has to be an organic process. It cannot be drafted in law schools, and it needs to build in. I think we have the legal framework. I don't think there's a danger in that, because we have General Comment 4. The Special Rapporteur has expanded the elements of housing. It can be brought in. And what is really important is the elements of non-discrimination. And we're seeing the kind of discrimination in housing, for single women, for Dalits, for Muslims, for LGBTQI communities. You don't even get a house on rent, right? The kind of moral policing that is going on. So we need a law to get rid of all these layers of discrimination. And two very important human rights principles, I think one is non-retrogression and non-repetition, which has to be built into a law, because the same communities are getting evicted time and again. So my time is up. I just want to end by saying that India just appeared at the Universal Periodic Review, and with a lot of difficulty, we managed to get 3 recommendations on housing. One of them is to integrate a human rights approach to housing in the country, and I think it also gives us the political space to mobilize, to put pressure on the government, because they are concerned about implementation at the UPR level. But just to end, I want to say that, there's so many people in this room, people from different disciplines, experts, lawyers, social activists. I really hope that by the end of this conference, we can create some kind of a network to help the people on the ground, because I think, just having these conferences and not being able to do something positive for the people whose rights are being violated is something that is really serious. And I'm really pained because, I work in Delhi, but I'm working with groups. Chennai evictions have just gone on. And in Mumbai also, Amitabh will talk about it. So I really hope we can come up with some constructive solutions and help build the momentum to create the space for right to housing law. So I rushed a bit, so I apologize for that, but thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shivani. I think somewhere we'll have to keep in mind that there's almost more or less a unanimity on the fact of that, yes, law as far as avoiding of housing, avoiding dehousing is concerned, how much we can be achieving through the law on the positive plane remains an open question. And nobody is saying it's like to have a legal right or not to have a legal right. I think somewhere what we want to worry about is what is it that you would where will you get yourself into if you have a legal right? So is it possible to think of it in more complex and less simplistic terms of yes or no? I think that's what we need to keep in mind. And the distinction between international law and national law can speak in generalities. International law can, speak in kinds of aspirations. Is that this way to go in national law also would be another issue that we need to flag. I move to my next speaker, who's again been engaging with a lot of especially subordinate legislation around housing, and especially on the way in which the recognition happens to deny people. She's one more speaker who's read Anandita's piece, so as has Liz Bidby, I'm hoping would be responding to that, and of course her own take on the issue. Introducing anybody because we have everybody's introduction in the brochure, and also I don't want to do that no introduction and then introduce, doesn't need introduction.
Okay. Thank you, namesake. I'll start talking about firstly, we spoke about bridge as multiple times, but one of the ways in which I would like to conceptualize really a bridge is to also think about a multi-sided bridge, okay? And I'll come to that. But first, let me begin with 3 contemporary scenarios in India and what I see, not just in Mumbai, but different cities of Maharashtra and wherever I have traveled in India. So one I think, is definitely this thing of the protection from the Leviathan. Okay, the violence, the impoverishment, the homelessness which accrues from evictions, forced ones, and the not so forced ones as well. Okay, and this is, I think, a very, very important scenario which happens almost like a regular kind of a target. Okay, so evictions are not a one-off thing, but in every state and in every city level department today, there are encroachment departments which would carry on evictions on a regular, targeted basis. There is a quota for evictions. Okay? And we do not think about the immense wastage of state resources and human resources which go into accumulating assets and then in the destruction of those and in the remaking of those. And it's important to cognize that. This is scenario one. The second, I think, something that we have not talked about so far is this definition of a place or a space called a slum. And I think it's important. It's important because what the term slum has today become a metonym for is an extremely flexible space for state and capital to operate. The way the state can deploy this kind of a space at any point in time. Just to give one example, in Bhubaneswar, which has been selected as a smart city now, they demolished houses which the state had constructed 2 years before under the Rajiv Awas Yojana. Okay? So extremely smart gesture, but for the state, if you are a slum which has been declared once, then forever you remain a slum. Okay? It doesn't matter what kind of tenure you have been given, what kind of housing has been provided for, what kind of assets have been created. You remain perpetually vulnerable to state action at any point in time, perhaps even after 25 years, 30 years, and so on and so forth. The third scenario that I want to talk about is the resettlement aspect which Renu talked about earlier, and what is happening in several other schemes in the form of slum redevelopment and so on and so forth, where the state is providing housing. Okay? And not just that it provides housing, but it compels and forces housing upon people. There are no defined standards for this housing which is provided for the state at all. And all my visits in Chennai, in Mumbai, in Ranchi, what I would claim is that a bulk of these settlements are perhaps worse than slum conditions. These are state-created slums, and just because the state has constructed them, they become termed as formal housing. And today, if one is thinking about all these contemporary scenarios, then one needs to begin to think about a right to housing, which perhaps addresses all three of these, perhaps also thinks about so the point that I want to make is, till yesterday we were thinking about, should there be a right to housing, and the only shortage or the only barrier to that right to housing is a shortage of resources, is an inadequacy of resources. I would suggest that the state definitely intervenes in housing. What is evident from all these three scenarios, that it is always there. In fact, it is investing considerable resources in intervening in housing. I think what we need to negotiate, what we need to discuss is how does one deploy those resources? What should be the direction of those deployment of resources? And I think that is where thinking about a right to housing comes in. In relation to the urban poor, I want to again suggest 2-3 different claims as well, from where I will come back to this right to housing all over again. Number one, the state is virtually absent as a provider of any kind of services when it comes to the urban poor. Whether it is, and you will see this in multiple realms, because each facility that people want to get into has to be contested or has to be gotten by stealth. So there is a multiplicity of strategies, but nowhere is the state present positively. On the other hand, all entitlements, almost all entitlements, I would say, that the people have are linked to housing. So if you have to have water, you have to have legal housing. If you have to have sanitation, you have to have legal housing. If you want to get into a school for a very long time, you had to provide a ration card, a proof of residence. If you want to have electricity, you want to have proof of residence. So everything gets linked to your housing claim. And the lack of what is called a formal housing claim almost criminalizes everything. So that's the third dimension. There are so many narratives which have been constructed in courts, in law, and outside of law, in the political discourse in relation to the urban poor, and which are all somewhere linked to this aspect of housing. These are things to do with partial citizenships. Only people till 1995 are eligible, till 2001 are eligible. So what happens after 2001? What happens after 1995? What happens when you declare a 1995 dateline in 2005? Are you going to send back all the people who have come between 1995 and 2000? So these are partial citizenships. You're talking of different country identities. So everybody who speaks Bangla becomes a Bangladeshi, a Pakistani. In my city, Mumbai, they almost perennially, if you are a Muslim, you become a terrorist. And therefore, most slums get associated with terror. And therefore, then there is eviction. You become security threats. The next set of narratives, you're all non-taxpayers. Okay? Property tax is the tax for a local body. And therefore, everyone who doesn't pay a property tax is a non-taxpayer, a burden on the municipal authority, and therefore virtually you're criminalizing all access to services, or you're creating a low quality access to services. The third, you're calling them encroachers, and each of them becomes then a barrier, sometimes to environment, sometimes to development, sometimes to infrastructure. So I think, how do we contest all of these narratives? So when Anandita asks that we have a moral claim to housing, I'm actually thinking about, is there a moral claim? Contesting all of these narratives and navigating through all of these narratives, I think this is the battle which several of my, I would say, activist lawyers have faced in court. Right? In order to battle that, we need to actually create a moral claim, a legitimacy for people to access the city. And to me, that would be one of the founding stones of creating this multi-sided bridge. To conclude, I want to just place 2-3 things before this August gatherings consideration. Number one, when the state acts as a vanguard and looks at slums as a flexibilized space in order to bring in a property rights regime, it's here. It's very much here. And that property rights regime gets connected intimately to the lives of the poor. Okay? A space till now which has been perhaps flexible, in terms of which they have been able to make multiple claims to the city, step by step, in very pragmatic, local kind of ways. But that's all changing with the property rights regime, which is coming in, where the state today, right since 2005, I would say there have been a spate of schemes which want to provide housing to people. Okay? And housing, which is then linked to bank loans. So Mumbai has a free housing scheme. You don't have a legal right to water, but you have a free housing scheme. And the kind of contradictions that creates, or a housing for all scheme in a country which doesn't talk about a right to work or any other right, but you have a housing for all scheme. Why are we conceptualizing a housing for all, and in this kind of a manner? And given this kind of a context, I think what we need to emphasize really is, I think that term housing is a very operative term. Rather than thinking about houses, we need to really think of housing the way Turner used it, the way we thought of really the facilitative role of the state, the enabling role of the state, in accessing and providing land to people, enabling that. Definitely creating institutions which facilitate finance to people, and what kind of mechanisms can be created for those. The third, I think, we need to think of ways in which we can create legitimacy for the urban poor so that they can move to multiple goals within the city. And therefore, the way I conceptualize a right to housing is something that definitely goes beyond the physical domain of housing and is able to create perhaps a more fair city, a more inclusive city. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amita. I think the point of inclusion and the point of some kind of an empowerment for the people to be starting to have their own vision being stamped on how they want to be looking at housing. We'd want to have Geeta Ramakrishna take that further, because someone who's really kind of lived it from the inside.
First of all, I wish to thank Nalsar University and Amita ji for inviting me. Of course, my heart is really now in Chennai because there is flood. The flood has started, and because of the monsoon, and it's a very bad situation. It's a very bad situation for two things. One is, of course, the pavement dwellers, they are facing the worst. And secondly, the court as well as the government has said they would displace 59,000 families from the city to basically protect them from flood. Imagine. And they are going to be removed and they are being removed to 40 kilometers away with and in a flood-prone area. Basically, it's a swamp in which they have built multi-storied building, which may probably collapse. That's the situation. So it is, it's a situation wherein the entire, history, has to be recalled, because Chennai has had a slum movement dating from 1910s, and led by the famous freedom fighters in Chennai. And in fact, in 1937, the interim government at that time, as well as the government which, was formed after independence, they, in 1956, both the times they passed a one-line legislation. There would be no evictions. And the slogan of the freedom fighters was squat. So I was telling him the same thing. The slogan is squat on public land. Who were the squatters? That is the laborers. The laborers who came into the city from the rural areas because there was work here, and also they were being sent out of the villages for social reasons or economic reasons, drought, etc. So where will they go? And wherever they found jobs, nearby public land you squat. Nearby temple land you squat. Nearby private lands also you squat. That was the slogan of the freedom fighters. And the squatter settlements where later, after 1956 law, in 1970, the Tamil Nadu Slum Areas Act was enacted. It was the first slum law in the country, and then much later in Karnataka, almost the same kind of same or similar law was enacted. And the Tamil Nadu Slum Areas Act, in fact, provides for they did an extensive survey, 1,500 slums were identified. They defined slum area as an insanitary, crowded settlement of the poor, and it was under the labor housing department. So basically it was recognition of the slum dwellers as laborers. And since laborers are needed for the city, they need to be housed, and that is why the slum areas were recognized. And the recognition of the slum areas was through notification of the slums, and then there was a next provision for protection against eviction. Then thirdly, provision of basic amenities, and if necessary, building of housing for them. So all these were part of the legislation. But then what we found was in the later, and so initially they did a lot of this, upward kind of, multi-storied tenements, of course, which were given, the slum clearance board was formed, of course, highly politicized, DMK, and then they gave it for contracts and, substandard buildings, all that. And then MGR came and then he said, I will implement the World Bank scheme, which means giving security of tenure and giving loan for building their own house, which is a much more sensible thing. And the MUDP, that's the name of the scheme, Madras Urban Development Project, which later became Tamil Nadu Urban Development Project, and they declared more slums in the whole of the state. So that was all, you can say, some kind of progressive, phase. But then, late 80s, after MGR's death, everything turned the other way. Then they, also the beginning of globalization. So this whole thing about Singapore, I think somebody talked about Singapore. That is the, now, that Chennai should become Singapore. So how can it become Singapore? Nobody knows. So they think by evicting slums, they become, it can become Singapore. So evict all the slums, rehouse them. I mean, of course, buildings have been built, multi-storied houses, and 40 kilometers away, using JNNURM funds and Rajiv Awas Yojana funds. And while JNNURM says clearly in its objective that in situ development should be there, there is not a single rupee was spent on in situ. Everything was, all the money they got from center was used only to do the resettlement housing. I mean, this is in short the history of the present, why we are in this predicament, because they want to fill those houses, so they are evicting all these people. This is one situation. So basically, we call this displacement to far-off places as neo-untouchability. We call it neo-untouchability because it is basically, and also we can say in the trade union parlance, it is invisible retrenchments. Because what has happened to these people is the domestic workers have lost their jobs, the construction workers have lost their jobs, almost, I mean, the Kannagi Nagar, now then Chemanjeri, and thirdly now Perumbakam, each having 1 lakh population. Basically it's like, I'm sorry. So it's disaster, I can say. It's not development, but disaster. And the other thing is you have the Supreme Court order on shelters, but the pavement dwellers will be at least 1 lakh in the city of Chennai, but no proper shelters and no family shelters. This is very serious problem. And of course, the migrant labor in the building sites, that is another very serious situation. Then if you go to the rural areas, the rural housing, in the 1971, they passed the Homestead Patta, whatever, the law was passed. And so land patta was given, all that. But now what is happening is, I can tell you, the whatever money that the center is supposed to give or is giving is so little, many villages have refused. Because they give money for building 4 houses for a village. And so it is impossible. So the whole problem is we need to see the adequate finance is a serious problem. So many panchayats refuse to use that. And while the agricultural laborers who are the worst affected, they have, this is a flood situation, cyclone situation. So every year the huts will go. Every year they have to borrow to even build their own huts. So it is a cycle of debt that we are, dealing with. And the last but not the least is the salt workers. In fact, the salt workers are working on salt lands which are entirely owned by the government of India. But they will not give one piece of land for housing the salt worker. And of course, they are very badly exploited, and monsoon is the worst time, all that. So the whole question is the same way with the plantation labor. In fact, I just want to recall that in Sri Lanka, the housing right to be a fundamental right is very much there. And that definitely has helped our plantation labor, the Tamil plantation labor, who are there in the Sri Lankan plantations. It is a boon because they cannot be evicted from those plantations. And I think housing has to become a fundamental right, number one. Number two, we need to also basically which will protect them against eviction. Protection against eviction and provision of basic amenities and basically provision of patta. I think that is the basic thing, that you need security of tenure for all the homeless, for all the slum people, while for homeless we need shelters, adequate number of shelters. Not only that, we also need the urban land ceiling. In Chennai alone, there is 12 square kilometers of land acquired by the government. And actually, the surplus land would be 60 square kilometers, but they acquired 12 square kilometers, but have not distributed. They are using it to build police stations, Tahsildar's offices, for government purposes. So we really need to ensure that the surplus lands are used for housing the homeless and the poor people. Thank you.
There was a miscommunication between the timekeeper and me. I think he was saying 5 minutes more and I heard it as over. I'm so sorry. Yeah. And anyway, I think we've had two speakers who are sort of talking in terms of the government virtually having a vested interest in providing people houses, and we need to be looking behind it, the entire, what is causing for that, and that may be something that you may have to think about, Netta, when you are talking about facilitating the market. It's facilitating the market in a very strange kind of a way. So we have the last speaker for the panel, who's coming in his second avatar, and also like somebody who's been kind of worrying a lot in terms of what kind of potential there is in the indeterminacy of the law, where you can be using it to think about legality and illegality in more imaginative terms. Of course, one more person on the panel who's looked at the study.
That was an amazing panel. Bombay, Chennai, Delhi, and Israel. The question is, are these instantiations, manifestations of the same universal problem, or is each of them pointing us in a different direction? And I think that's the struggle that we need to intellectually deal with. That's where partly the question of, if you construct a legal right, statutorily or in whatever other form, are you going to construct it at the international level? Are you going to construct it at the national level? Are you going to construct it at the city level? So I think there's partly a question of universality and that concreteness and the experience of different cities. I think there's also the question of the scale, at what scale are we going to do this and so on. But what I really loved about the panel is that there is a very strong specificity and a particular kind of anger coming from each of the cities, each of the places. And I think that's very important for us to hold on to. What is the anger in Hyderabad? What is the anger in Bombay? What is the anger in Chennai? What is the anger in Delhi? What is the anger in Israel? I'm saying this because one of the dimensions of rights that we often forget about is that rights are contestatory claims. They're dynamically constructed. You ask for a right, you win it, you sometimes put it into the statute because you can ask for something bigger. It enables you to do something bigger. And that's what housing is all about. You want shelter for the homeless in the city so that they can build something bigger. And that would then lead to a bigger fight. And I think in the case of housing, because this is something which has to be done concretely, therefore it is subject to local opportunities, local struggles, local social formations, political formations, and all sorts of things like that. We need to think about what is it that we need to place in the local government. What is the accountability of the local government? And we have nothing at all on that. And that has to do with a much larger problem of cities in India, local governments in India, in general, not having any agency at all. They're all creatures of the state government. And therefore, their understanding of the space in which they are operating is pretty blind. They're completely spatially blind. Left is the same as right in broad theory. In reality, what happens is left is evaluated, right is evaluated through processes that never become open to question. So how do we construct that? That I think then leads to this other question of, is this even a problem of building new statutes? Or is this a question of reconstructing jurisprudence, of creating values which have just not been generalized enough? Where is this work that needs to be done? I think it's in that context that we are constantly seeing that you have policies, and when we mean policy, it almost always is a scheme. It's not even a policy, it's a scheme. The scheme, along with a certain amount of money, a certain amount of resources, becomes available to different cities, which is hardly ever really substantial enough for the city. And in a context where your planning and the practice of planning itself and its implementation is one that is constantly pushing people out of the city. Mr. Shore is here. He will probably have a much better sense of exactly how much percentage of land is available for poor in the city, which is probably very, very small, right? 2%. And that's that we are looking at in all cities. In Chennai, it's 2%. I don't know what it is in Hyderabad. Hyderabad, in the plan, you're supposed to block something like 25% in each layout. They reduced it to 10%. And they have said that the 10% also they will not do in each layout. They will do it within a radius of 10 kilometers from the layout. So basically what you're doing is moving people up. But this is not the story only of Hyderabad. In Delhi, when they had to deal with this, what they have done is to construct servant quarters in each of the development. And in some cases, they haven't even built those servant quarters. They actually built a servant room to the apartment itself. That is where you get the Mahagun Moderne kind of struggle. So you have the gated community, and then outside of it, you have all the people living, somehow managing to survive. They have no way of going anywhere else. This is the broad situation, taking on board all of the things that have been said from the different experiences of different cities as to what needs to be done. I want to add 2 or 3 more things to this. One of them is the issue of revenue categories and how those revenue categories are actually translated into planning practices. One of the things that we have seen across the board in all the cities, all the villages, is gradually certain very vaguely defined norms about land categories which had meanings in the practices of the revenue boards of a certain time have been lost over a period of time. And that is the starting point of land actually becoming private property at such a large scale in the city. The reason why people are actually able to survive in our cities even till now is because our land records are a mess. They're such a complete mess that nobody is able to, without a huge amount of violence, actually claim ownership of any piece of land. That's the kind of place where people are actually creating housing. Just think about Hyderabad itself. The largest housing development in Hyderabad in the last 15 years has happened in the southern part of the city between 3 villages where there was a lot of open land. That has been occupied. And that has been brought into the land market where the ownership is not very clear. People have some sort of a document, and they have created a huge amount of housing there, which then allows people to go to Charminar and find work in the informal economy. This is what is going on in not just Hyderabad. Go to Delhi, you will find the commons of the urban and the rural villages within the Delhi, which sometimes have been taken over by the DDA, but the DDA has not managed to actually police its boundaries very clearly. That's where you have the Juggi Jhopdi colonies, that's where you have the unauthorized colonies, that's where stuff happens. So essentially what is going on in our cities is that people are able to survive because they are finding little cracks in the system. And they're inserting themselves into those cracks and creating opportunities for themselves. What does that mean? It means to me that while we are talking about strategies for actualizing housing rights, housing itself is a strategy for people. It's a strategy for some sort of an extended reproduction of life, of improving their lives, and that strategy involves saving a little bit of money, sending their child to school, being able to groom one child to go and do some job, getting one child married off and so on. So for some of them, in certain contexts, a house as property becomes meaningful, but for most of them it doesn't even become that. It's neither accessible. Even if it is accessible, they're not really interested in that, because for them, it's a question of, for the next 20 years, do I have some sense of guarantee and permanence here? There's a friend of mine who's an MLA in Pondicherry who said this very beautifully once. He said that a slum is essentially a permanent temporariness. And that's the most horrifying thing about the slum, that tomorrow morning, I do not know if my daughter's school certificates are going to be there in the trunk in which I put them. Are they going to get washed away? Are they going to get drenched? Are they going to get burnt? I don't know. So how do we deal with that permanent state of temporariness, which seems to attach itself to particular kinds of bodies, right? It gets attached to bodies which are Dalit, which are Muslim, which are migrant, which are something else, and so on. So in that sense, I think that one possible direction in which we could look at this, whether we construct it at the scale of the city or at the national level, is that anti-discrimination law. And I think it's really, really important to put that in place so that you have one tool. Another tool which I think for a lot of people would be very, very meaningful is the right against dehousing, because it's very simply put, in most instances you think about this when your life strategy to be able to move through the next 5 years or 10 years is going to be thwarted. It's thwarted at so many different levels that you need to figure out how to deal with this. The third thing, which is a combination of these two, I think one of the things that we really now have to sit down and think very, very, very urgently about is that evictions, which is the most dramatic, forced, people being kicked out, bulldozers being brought out, is one manifestation. There is a very, very large other process which is going on, which is death by 1,000 cuts. It's constant degradation, constant degeneration, constantly being deprived of one small thing, which makes life so horrible that people just leave. And I just stop by giving you two instances, both of which are not thought about as housing problems. One instance is, we know that in most of the labor addas in Hyderabad, which is the daily wage centers, where people come from the villages, and that's the first entry point into the city. Women who come into those places waiting to be picked up, around 11 o'clock, if the work does not happen, if somebody doesn't get picked up, they switch over to sex work. There's no other option. When they switch over to sex work, in most instances, you have women who are unwilling to or incapable of dealing with the aggression and violence, and within 1 year's time they decide to go back. So either you make it in the city within that 1 year, and then you become somehow conversant with the rules of the game and manage to live, or escape from that and find some other route into the city, or you go back. Most of us don't think about this as a housing problem, but it is a housing problem. Right? That's one. Another instance, in most universities, in the 70s and 80s, in our hostel rooms, we would have friends coming in and overstaying. If I have one room, 4 of my friends would come and sleep there. Today, in most universities, extra people coming and staying in your room has to be a Dalit student. Because most of the students who are coming into universities are students from rural areas. They have no access to anything in the city. There are not that many hostels, so they go into the university hostel rooms and stay with their friends. And therefore, from the student, from the friends that are staying in the room, everybody somehow becomes illegal on campus, because where do they get to eat food from? They have to go and scramble around in the hostel mess. Nobody thinks about this as a housing problem. It's a serious housing problem because thousands of people coming into the city have no option but doing this. That's a second lot. I can go on talking about dozens of instances like this, but I'm not going to. Amita is very vigorously shaking her head. I'm pointing out that these are the kinds of things that we need to think about as the housing problem. If this is the housing problem, the broader question of how do we deal with all of these things, we need to think about what tools do we need to put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to sort of straight away throw it open to the House, because I think each one of them in their own way have kind of demonstrated to you exactly how complex is this issue and how it doesn't really merit a yes-no answer. But the various kinds of answers that we can at least attempt to or try to think together, I would sort of specific questions would be preferred in the first instance. Time left over, I'll allow general comments. So I would want you to categorize very clearly in your head, are you asking a question or making a comment? Yes, Virginia.
I dare not make a comment, I will just ask the question. And my question is to Anindita. I haven't read your piece, but I'm responding to what you just said in terms of it being difficult to define the content of the right to housing. And indeed, that's true for many rights of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But don't you think that as long as we pursue this notion that the rights are difficult to define, they're vague, that we would be strengthening the position of governments that these rights are really second-class rights and that they do not merit to be justiciable because we cannot even define their content? The second issue is, don't you see the positive approach in defining the content? I know it's difficult. That's where we lose most of the time. Because what we want to achieve is to indicate the obligations of governments, but you cannot do that without defining the content of the right. So while I would agree with you that it's difficult, I think there is more benefits from trying to define the content. It may not be perfect, than remaining in this very comfortable position that we don't even want to go there because we will have a very restrictive definition, etc. My second question quickly is to Neeta. When you talk of the state as the enabler, Neeta, this is something that is becoming a mantra now, the state as the enabler. My fear is that the state as the enabler is in a certain way the state progressively moving away from its obligations. You need to look at all these public-private partnerships, whatever. Don't you think that as long as we condone this as the only way out for public services, or to be privatized, or to be decentralized, that we're letting off the governments, letting off the hook, and not making them remember that it is their ultimate responsibility towards the people who live in their countries? Thank you.
My question is also to Anita. I took from your paper that we should consider other ways to regulate the free market, and I suppose, want to have a quick, brief comment on that. In Ireland in 1971, 15.5% of all housing was provided by the state. That figure is 7% today. We're clearly moving to a free market model, but correlation with that, and I accept it's not totally down to moving to a free market model, our homeless crisis is on the increase. Yes, I'm getting to the question. So between 2013 and 2017, our homeless figure increased by 34%. So my question is, if we are, and we have put in some regulations to the free market, but clearly they're not working. So if that is a solution, which I don't accept it should be the solution, if it is the solution, what type of regulation, who would enforce it, where? Because if the government are having a hands-off approach, how do we then regulate that free market as a potential solution. Personally, I think rights is the right way forward.
A suggestion about this session and a comment. The suggestion is, this for me has been completely mind-blowing. I think that the facts presented today, they may be familiar to you, but they are certainly not familiar to the development community, even to this member of it who tries to follow India a bit. We don't know these things, and we need to know them. Can they please be written down and made accessible, preferably in one longish paper? Just, transcripts of this would be wonderful. These facts are not known, and they need to be known. The second point, I, like the last speaker, live in a country that has had a very different but sort of dream parallel of this experience. That is, the state deliberately collapsing the social housing market by selling off 200,000 council houses to the, as it happens, to the sitting tenants, not to the wealthy. But then making the provision of housing almost entirely dependent on free market provision, very, very little of which was for the poor. Affordable housing is a sham. So it's not really neoliberalism. I hate this word neoliberalism. This is crony capitalism. This is opening up the public space to non-competitive private enterprise which is in cahoots with the state. And I think we have to understand this process and stop using the fine and honorable word liberalism, even with the prefix neo, as a code for crony capitalism abetted by the state.
I have a simple comment. This discussion has been very eye-opening and very poignant. But we have all missed one aspect, and that is the aspect of distress migration, which is caused not by acts or policies of the state or government, but which is caused by so-called nature. I refer to internal migration due to flooding, due to other so-called natural disasters. But more importantly, in my last sentence, I refer to the possibility in 2050 of the entire country called Bangladesh disappearing because the sea levels are rising. A lot of Bombay, Calcutta and Madras will go down under, not all of it. And so there will be many climate change refugees who will be, when you talk about dehousing, you perhaps have no idea of how many climate change refugees even South Asia will have by the year 2030 or 2050. And forget about refugee commitment because that doesn't deal with these problems. What will be dehousing in 2000? Agenda 2030 is laid out. Paris, what will be dehousing in 2050? By the time you work out a policy of housing rights and put it in the Constitution, I hope you do. I worked for 10 years with Union and prepared this bill that you refer to, Shivani, and we all worked. But that didn't happen. What will happen in 2050? We should bring it forward as if it is happening now and include in the so-called right to dehousing.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lavanya Suresh. I teach at BITS. I had a question to the entire panel, except for Dr. Anant. It seems like local government is considered as a space where housing cannot be addressed, and it's there in the Constitution. Schedule 7 and 12 do mention local housing as a issue for both panchayat and municipality. So I was wondering if you all could comment on what you all think the role of local government is in that case. And the second question is with regard to local of land mafias. We seem to sanitize the entire process when we talk about legal rights to housing, where land mafia is part of the reality.
Rahul Gandhi. I'm fascinated by your idea that the indeterminacy is the legal indeterminacy is one of the hopes of survival for people. But at the same point of time, the other discourse is towards greater certainty, and I think in the previous session, that was emphasized that the uncertainty makes poor more vulnerable than the rich. So how do we look at that chasm? Thank you.
My question is with respect to the possible role of the United Nations in issues of housing and affecting housing rights. The UN Programme on Human Settlements, UN Habitat, has a strong commitment to values such as community involvement in housing, government accountability, sustainability, and effective monitoring and evaluation, and indeed has an entire unit that that advocates these values in the form of national urban policy that it recommends to member states. So I'm just wondering really if any of the panelists would see a significant role for the United Nations in these important questions being discussed.
Hi, I'm Shruti from Center for Child in the Law, Bangalore. My question is to Professor Bide. You linked housing with other entitlements like water and sanitation. So my question is, how are Aadhaar cards given to homeless people? Because a lot of other entitlements are being linked to Aadhaar cards like BPL cards and ration and all of that. So how are homeless people being given Aadhaar cards?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Shruti Pandey, and I'm a human rights practitioner. My question is to the panel, but maybe to Nita, since brought it up first. So when and this is building on the question asked by Virginia, if we give up the claim on state as a provider and compromise with the enabler claim, given the political economy where both the claims are anyway going to be quite weak in the absence of a claim to the land. I'm just playing the devil. Should we give up the claim? Should we then focus on the claim to the land? Because I'm just thinking that when we make the claim on the state as an enabler and not a provider, then we are running into the danger of converting housing into property right, in which case the land right is being denied because the state is which is what the housing for all seems to be, and that could be actually a counterproductive claim that we're making on the state. That's a question.
Okay, so my question is purely theoretical to the panel and Professor Bakshi. Since Professor... So, since Professor Bakshi was talking about the concept of commons and urban commons and the right to city, as was conceptualized by David Harvey, I was wondering if all the discussion that we had on homelessness and homeless people would be accommodated in the concept of urban commons as conceptualized by Harvey.
Quickly, in fact, my first point was to Nita. It's like I was wondering in terms of when talking about housing and all, and the market and its role and all. I was wondering that this is a person called Sam Semiris, who's from Canada, and I remember he talks about housing first. Like how in Canada and many parts of US and Finland and all, they've gone about giving houses to people who got mental issues, and that in a way has also handled mental issues, and that's one model where I think Finland is going in a big way of removing homelessness altogether. So if you have any other such experiences, you can share on that. That's important, actually, you know. Two is, of course, to Anita, like, you know, I do agree that the National Campaign for Housing Rights, when it came out with the bill in 1992, is a fascinating bill, where they talk about dwellers union and all that. And, you know, I think it's still workable. So if you have to think about a legal right, I suppose that's one bill already we have. We have to just maybe modify it in the present conditions. But as such, it's very good. And to Shivani, that, you know, that the Sudama Singh order, recently the Delhi government has agreed to provide housing to all of them who were listed as petitioners. So that's a decision which they've taken a month ago. So that's something we impressed upon them, and then they've agreed to that.
My question is to Amita ji. When you look at the role of state versus... No, Amita Bhide, sorry. When you look at the role of the state and the debate as to withdrawal of state from housing, and Professor Lipton spoke of it as a form of crony capitalism, but isn't there a need to look also very closely at what state agencies themselves have been doing? And there are a fair degree of work to show that in Delhi Development Authority acquired land sat upon public land, and such land has not then been available for housing for economically weaker section of the society. So in the debate between state and private sector, shouldn't we be looking much more closely at what state agencies connected with housing are doing, and how democratic and accessible their policies are? And I had one more question, and perhaps also a comment with respect to what Geeta ji said. If you mentioned Sri Lanka and the plantation labor and the fact that there was an obligation on the employer to provide housing. We have a similar legislation in India, although that's in danger of being further diluted and anyway poorly implemented. Do you see that as a feasible model, given that we often see evolution and setting up of housing colonies very close to work sites, that we should be talking of housing rights together with labor rights and speak very closely and very vocally about employers' obligation to provide housing, something that in many public sector establishments in the past were routine? Thank you.
So I will just take on the two specific questions addressed to me. So one is with respect to the
panel, because we don't come back.
Sure. Okay. So about the homeless people and the entitlements and the Aadhaar card. So I think when Aadhaar was actually introduced, it was introduced as something which would make a universal entitlement possible, irrespective of where your residency is located, and something which was promised in some ways as would be a boon to also migrants, etc., etc. Okay. What one has seen very interestingly is that therefore there was this campaign. In fact, many of the initial Aadhaar card vanguards, I would say, were also civil society organizations which believed in this universality. Okay? I've seen in Mumbai, for example, that the first people to register and enroll for Aadhaar cards, irrespective of all the difficulties, were the people who were homeless, who were recent migrants, etc. Okay? Has the Aadhaar card given other entitlements? It's not been linked to any entitlement, including school admissions. Okay? So I think this thing of how these linkages have been made, okay, Aadhaar card has been just given as, I don't know what it symbolizes currently, other than perhaps the linkage to bank accounts, etc., which has been made. But on the ground, there is no real entitlement which the Aadhaar cards have given. It remains a notion, and which perhaps could have been. It's today, I think, in Mumbai, especially, and in other cities in Maharashtra, I see the ration card delivering much more than perhaps the Aadhaar card. And the ration card is very, very local. It's very, very city government specific. Okay. So the second, I think, in terms of Saurav, right, your question about the debate between the state and the private sector. I think what I'm trying to point out towards is the very peculiar nature of the state in India, when I see this in relation to housing, land, and real estate. Okay? I think the kind of political economy that we have created with respect to land and housing is where it's not just crony capitalism. I think at all levels of the bureaucracy and politics, there is a huge nexus which has been created with the private sector. And I think slums and all these things with respect to slums happen because slums in cities in India are located on extremely central lands, which are today seen as high-value lands, and therefore, in fact, the state acts as a vanguard. It talks of, like in Mumbai, the scheme that we have is called a slum rehabilitation scheme. It thinks of the state doing favor for the poor, and it's a compulsory favor. Okay? So you have no choice. Okay? It's not as if you can opt for the scheme, opt out of the scheme. There are no choices there. Okay? So I think this is the point to be made. Okay? That I agree with you that the debate needs to be nuanced, but in the Indian case, I would particularly suggest that it is the state which is acting as a vanguard, like the front runner, bringing in capital behind along with it. Okay? So, and I think to me that's the nuance, in fact. Right? The third is in, I think, the question that you addressed the panel about the role of city governments. Okay? But I think, in my view, if I read the 12th schedule to the 74th constitutional amendment, housing is not mentioned in any of the list of 18 functions. It is very much seen as a state government function. It's not on the central list. Okay? So this is one. The second is, there is a clear trend post-2000 to bring in huge amounts of central government funding and role into housing. Okay? So I think today we need to nuance this debate with seeing that the state wants to provide houses. It doesn't want to provide housing or look at housing as a right, because it's associated with all of these aspects. And therefore, the role of city governments I see as an impossibility currently. Even in JNNURM, where city governments have tried to implement housing, and now in Housing for All, there is a role being ascribed to city governments. It's not been very successful. City governments do not have the capacity for doing this.
Yeah, I only wanted to clarify that in the past, municipalities have built houses all over the country. So if today that activity does not appear in the 12th schedule, it will not mean that they cannot do it. So that's it.
So in terms of the general question, Amita, just to follow up on what you said, international law actually makes it obligatory for local governments to also implement the laws that your countries have ratified at the international level. So there is a legal obligation. Many local governments do not even know about this. Also, the new urban agenda that emerged from Habitat 3 has given a lot of role to local governments to play in implementing the right to the city. But what is happening, we are seeing parallel process of smart cities which call for special purpose vehicles to be set up in the 90 smart cities that we have. And these are again public-private bodies which are completely bypassing your elected government officials, which violates the 74th Amendment. So these are trends that are dangerous. I think the role of the land mafia, you said, yes, it's a very big problem in cities. And I think that also reiterates the need for the rights over land, because the fact that, that land is contested domain that allows this land mafia to enter and completely dominate it through various illegal means. And I think this whole notion of the encroacher is something that is becoming very, very dangerous, right? So I think that's something that has to be dealt with. I have one general comment I'll make later if there's time. So.
Basically, in cities in Tamil Nadu, normally, they have built houses for the Safai Karamcharis that they have done. But otherwise, they have not provided housing. It's our slum clearance board which had built houses all over the state. And The Safai Karamcharis, even for them, now they are not anymore building anything because it's all under contract. So they have become contract labor and they don't care. So that is the situation. And as far as labor, I think unless they are recognized as laborers who have contributed to the economy of the city, the whole question of, their being part of the city, will never happen. So their contribution to the city has to be recognized. That is very important. Same way the plantation labor, the plantation owners should, provide housing, and they have so much land, they can easily provide them. The same thing with agricultural laborers also. The homestead land law actually provides for 5 cents of land for all the agricultural workers. That is the thing. But in fact, Ekta Parishad had, at the end of the Yatra, I think they came to an agreement with Jairam Ramesh about 10 cents of land. And the reasoning is that that there should be some level of food security. I think that is the, so that they don't become bonded labor. Because it is these people, once there is drought and other things, they move to the city or they move to some place, some employer, and they become bonded labor. So to avoid bondage, the land becomes a very, very important, it's not just asset, but a resource, basic resource for survival. And what we are talking about is whether it is the slum dwellers or the pavement dwellers or the rural people, it is for survival. And today the prices are going up on everything. So at least let the housing be demanded as a fundamental right and ensured to each worker. That is our, concern.
So I want to clarify where I'm coming from with this idea. I'm not a free market person. I hope you got that. And I don't think the market can supply adequate housing. I also don't think that it's realistic to go back to the welfare state as we had known it in the past, unfortunately. Okay, so my philosophical part of my mind is struggling with my pragmatic part of my brain, and I'm trying to think, okay, in a day and age where we are, obviously I'm not letting the state off any hook at all. On the contrary. But I think the dichotomy between direct provision and free market is not the only way to look at things. In Israel, for 3 decades, we had very thick state involvement on the supply side, as we call it, the provision side of housing, and we moved completely in the opposite direction, in a true belief that the market, if we only make it work better and we, take off the obstacles, the market will provide. We are calling the state back in. Part of it is to bring back the provision. There has to be a piece of provision in it, because no matter what incentives and what kind of policies, the market will never provide housing for the poor, not just for the poorest, for the poor, the low income. And then there has to be more state regulation, which can give land for free. That's half provision, half regulation. Subsidies, tax incentives, the state is giving, it's in there, but not as a direct provider. And I think that if we look at what's going on in other in capitalist countries and in crony capitalist countries as well, we see a lot of municipal and state involvement in the housing market, much more than we would think there is New York City, for example, now has a mandatory inclusionary zoning, not in all parts of New York, but in several parts of New York, where the state, who, by the way, runs a local bank to support social housing and has a very big department for affordable housing, and doesn't have any more public land because it gave it all away in the 70s and in the 80s, is trying to get involved in structuring the market. And this is what I'm talking about, okay? Of course, not letting go and not letting the state off the hook, but not kind of falling into the dichotomy of either direct provision or complete state market. And housing first is one of the policies, but it's one among many. The main incentive of creating of affordable housing in the United States is a federal program of, it's called low-income housing tax credits, but it's really direct subsidies, okay, that can be traded in the financial markets. So the state has to be in there in just more than one way. And I think we have to, I'm saying this as a human rights advocate. For 15 years I did Supreme Court litigation in Israel. That's what I know how to do, okay? And I find myself now doing real estate deals, and I'm horrified, right? Because this is not so. But I think that human rights lawyers cannot afford not to go into this field of finance and tax if we leave it only to professionals that are paid by big money. We will lose. We have to go in there as well, and not only talk about rights and litigation. That's my point.
Very quickly respond to some of them. I don't think that I'm talking about, this is partly my response to this question of how productive is the uncertainty or indeterminacy, and how does that then reconcile with the need for concreteness? I think it's essentially a question of what kind of concrete and how much space do we have to determine what is the concrete in each instance. Say if I'm in Singapore right now, I would fight for a certain amount of floor space to be available to everybody regardless of their identity. Would be a very important fight for me. But that's because it is Singapore, right? And it has a history of about 40 or 50 years of having completely razed down kampongs and built vertical units within which they have allotted a certain space. There's no way we can go back. There's no way we can go back to those earlier claims. I don't think it's my phone. In terms of very concreteness, just think about the issue of minimum wages. How is the minimum wage computed? There's no housing component in that. It's not my phone either. I put it away. Minimum wage is does not include a computation of housing cost. So what are we really thinking when we say that we're ensuring minimum wage to so many people? Where are they going to live? We have essentially already acknowledged that they don't have a need for housing, right? So the question then is, should housing rights be thought of as a portmanteau of rights? Can we even come up with an exhaustive inventory of rights? Or should we create a set of tools which can then be used to determine what kinds of concrete things need to be done in each city, in each context, at each point of time? I'm inclined towards saying that what we need to do is to create a set of tools, to create a set of tools and then work with that, where within that at certain points of time you may want specific rights. And I think that it is really, really important to leave the concreteness of that to the city level. We can have broad guidelines at a higher level. Otherwise, for the last 60, 70 years, Government of India has been saying that we will provide housing. Every plan period, they have made numbers of how many people are there in this country, how many households, and how many built units are there. They said we will bridge the gap. And what they have done is to build a few houses somewhere where nobody can go and live. And that happens simply because you don't know how to scatter your resources across such a huge territory. So that's the issue. The common question to the entire panel about local governments, I think it's really important for us to recognize that local governments actually do not have any agency at all in this country, zero. Which is one of the reasons one of my friends, Partha, often says that how can cities in India be smart? Because to be smart, you should be able to do something smart, and Indian cities just cannot do anything. They don't have any agency, right? So therefore they cannot be smart. They cannot be stupid either, but that's a different matter. The thing is, I think from the 74th Constitutional Amendment onwards until now, a very, very important process has actually been underway. And that process is that cities and villages have not been given any political agency, but on the flip side, they have been burdened with financial responsibility, to the extent that all of them are desperately trying to make money from land. So every single IAS officer that is involved in any way with any kind of government institutions in cities, they all see themselves as land grabbers. You know, you grab land for your department, you're not grabbing it for your personal self, but you are a land grabber ultimately, and that's all you can do, right? On the other hand, municipal corporations are burdened with the responsibility of raising resources to make schemes happen. And they just cannot make it happen. You know, so 2 years ago when the government of Hyderabad Municipal Corporation wanted to suddenly realized that they were short by something like 600 crores. Where are they going to get the 600 crores from? Right? I think that's the process where financial responsibility has been devolved. No other powers have been devolved. And in that context, we really cannot do anything much.
I think that I'm just going to respond to the question on the positives of definition and whether we are ceding power to naysayers when we speak about the difficulty of speak about the difficulty in the act of definition in the law. I don't think I'm in any which way denying that the need for accountability, the importance of justiciability where it's possible. I think that's why this conversation is happening. But I do think that amongst lawyers, especially, there is the counter side is often not acknowledged. That there are costs as well associated with the absorption of a certain claim into the law. Often goes unacknowledged. And I think that that's why I began with that. Which is to say that are there other ways outside of legal articulation to guarantee the realization of the substance of the right to housing, which is to say guarantee everyone has access to housing as they see fit, and this is not to say only market, but how else can political will be mustered? Which is also to say that mere legal recognition outside of working different arenas doesn't serve any great purpose, because you might have legal recognition and no will whatsoever to actually implement or direct the flow of resources and such like. So that's where I was coming from, not in any which way to cede ground to those who think that there is this hierarchy of rights. I think we're all in agreement that there isn't. But to say as a law person that we need to think a little more when we encode things into law, where do we put it? What serves what purpose? That's more what I was going for.
The fact that apart from to request to renew my request for significance. Namely, do think in your leisure, but not too much leisure, even in Hyderabad, to think, not to think about climate change and global warming. It's already upon us. And therefore, you cannot have a de-housing policy thinking or any thinking on human rights without bringing in the Anthropocene as a part of a looming challenge to humankind as a whole. On your question, it is very simple. The control over urban and rural space, the right to city, control of urban space, the right to city began and has developed as a subaltern concept, not as a town planning or regulation, aesthetic regulation concept like the malls we have. They're called aesthetic, Americans have a doctrine, constitutional law doctrine called aesthetic regulation for zoning laws and for malls and for other things. We have brought it in Vasant Kunj malls in Delhi. The High Court has brought it. So it is right to city in one word is a subaltern concept. It's developed by people who have no say in city affairs, who not merely want to have a say, but you want to have a major say in the control of space.
Thank you so very much.
Question. I don't know.
Thank you so very much. I mean, we are 20 minutes ahead of time, beyond time, but the only point I wanted to make is that the rule is that the speakers will not be given more time, but the House always will be, wherever we can. So, yes. Yes, because I'm sorry we have gone past, and I just felt that there was one level of balance there. And if there are queries, it's a question of how well can you clothe your comments in a question. Yes. Walk towards the stadium where we're going to have the street artist performance. We have about 10, 15, 20 minutes as we trot on there and fill up the stadium and start the performance there. I mean, the artists are there and they're all in